Hello there! So when it comes to mapping, people generally direct all their attention towards the peaks. We're so interested by high star rating and crazy impossible maps like those I've covered from Miss Maggie's or Mazarin that we forget to sometimes look down towards the hills, towards the maps of a difficulty level that most experienced Osu players haven't touched for years. Low diffs like easies and normals. Most mappers, myself included, think of creating low difficulties as just another mundane step in the process of getting a map ranked. Easy and normal diffs are just kinda boring, unlike the hype higher up the climb. That said, it's hard to believe, but there are mappers who actually care about the ways they make low difficulties. In this video, we'll showcase one who's made that view known in recent time.
I'm Myxomatosis, previously known as Desperate Kun. Currently I'm part of the Beatmap nomination group, and I used to be part of the quality assurance team for some years.
Aside from his notable positions in the modding side of things, Myxo stands out to me as one of the few people who goes against the grain with low diff creation in an environment where practically everyone sticks to conventions due to a lack of interest. Low difficulties haven't always been so dull though. I've heard rumors that mappers of the past weren't quite so, let's say, strict to the point of being stale with their low diffs. That's why, through our conversation, I wanted to learn how easy normal difficulty construction developed and possibly degraded over time. So we started with how he viewed some iconic periods of low difficulty creation throughout history.
From 2007 to 2010, I'd say. Regarding lower diffs, there was one important difference to mapping today. People were still playing normals. Mappers paid more attention to how their lower diffs actually played out, instead of just relying on experience or teaching from other mappers. Some mappers were copying the style of the DS games, but a lot of mappers tried to do something else and ended up making maps with really weird rhythms where it's hard to see the connection to the song. Overall, there was a huge diversity in map quality.
And the map you're seeing now is one Myxo found especially nice from that period. Made by DJ Pop, the normal diff is cool because of the contrast between circles and sliders between musical sections, as well as how the reversing slider idea is replicated within the spread. That multi-diff spread connection is something lots of older maps valued, even through the next sort of era for low difficulties. According to Myxo, that era was from around 2010 to 2013 and was marked mainly by the more capable experimentation that came from it. Mappers understood, how to map at this point, and it showed through some standout mappers like Mr. Unreadable Name here.
Hiatus by WCX stands out to me in this time because of how connected the whole spread feels. While the majority of maps from that time use distance map, this one connects everything through visual spacing and blanketing, which is quite unusual for this time, but actually a lot of mappers do something like this today. What's great here though is that the normal does the exact same thing. Especially in the chorus, the spacing and slider velocity is pretty high, which pushes the difficulty, but the objects don't interact linearly like you would expect in a lower diff. There's actually a huge amount of direction changes and sharp angles, which makes the map a very unique experience to play and also very expressive of the song.
Some of these low diff mapping techniques that Myxo praises, like multi-reversing sliders or non-linear object arrangements, are frowned upon by mappers and modders now though. They're treated as too hard for their respective difficulty level because they aren't straightforward reading-wise and are therefore avoided. I'm not a new player, so I can't judge whether these changes are helpful or not exactly, but I know that this limited view on low diff design is the mapping domain I grew up in that essentially influenced all low diff construction now.
2013 to 2016 is what I would call the dark ages of lower diff mapping. There were a couple of really active modders here, me included, that told many mappers, especially new mappers, how very strict thoughts about low diffs, but we actually didn't really know what we were talking about because we just heard it from other mappers. And since nobody was really playing the lower diffs anymore, at least in the mapping community, it was hard for everyone to judge for themselves. For example, the term polarity was really popular in that time. It came from a video from Charles445. His idea was that it's better to avoid irregular rhythm gaps, but he was talking about higher difficulties. Then a lot of people started applying that to lower difficulties and basically thought that 3 half gaps were completely unreadable for newbies for some odd reason. And that's why a lot of mappers started just making whole beat chains everywhere with the same gap each time between each object, just because it was considered easier. So in the end, everything was a lot more bland than it was before. From 2016 until today, I'd say that lower diff mapping has gotten a lot better again, and one of the reasons for that might have been the change to the ranking criteria. There are still a lot of mappers who make really boring and bland lower difficulties, but there are also quite a few mappers that stand out with higher quality lower difficulties and that try to pay a little bit more attention to them.
So what was the cause of the shift from the so-called Dark Ages to the current better world for low difficulties? Myxo mentioned something about ranking criteria changes, which are relevant because how the ranking criteria handled low diffs prior to 2017 was, plainly put, wrong.
The old ranking criteria required lowest diff normals to be a maximum of 2 stars because back then no guidelines or rules existed about what makes a suitable lower difficulty. So the star rating was the easiest way to handle that. But keeping the star rating low is pretty difficult on lowest diff normals, especially on a high BPM. The solution is using a lot of sliders because sliders are underrated by the star rating algorithm compared to circles. This makes sense on higher difficulties, but it doesn't make so much sense for easy and normal, because a circle you just aim and click, while a slider you have to aim for the head, then follow it along, and the following along part is especially difficult for newbies that still use something like acceleration on their mouse or something. So basically, some mappers had to make their maps harder for it to have lower star rating. At least that's how I see it.
Even for higher difficulties, star rating is a terrible point of reference for difficulty, so the same being true for low diffs is only natural. Most normals you see now are above 2 stars, and many reach into the hard icon territory, including when they're used as a lowest difficulty of a map set. This was, again, the result of a change in the ranking criteria, which Myxo was closely involved in. He was part of the quality assurance team in 2016, and one of his roles was the founding of the initial Ranking Criteria Council, which, after some internal struggles, managed to produce a new ranking criteria.
And we were supposed to make a new ranking criteria because the old one was really outdated. So what we did was making a list of potentially problematic patterns or mapping techniques, and then we created maps that included those techniques and got random newbies to test play them and just observed how well they did. What this showed was that a lot of unwritten rules from the time were basically nonsense. For example, requiring distance spacing to be used everywhere, because the newbies don't actually use a ruler and measure like the distance between 2 circles on their screen. They just go by their intuition.
So, the new standards for low diffs were established, but the 2-star rule wasn't removed until the infamous spread proposal was amended. While this document is more known for its unsuccessful attempt to limit the number of difficulties allowed on a map set, the positive side of it didn't receive much notice. With almost universal approval, this 2-star limit rule was changed to be the lowest difficulty cannot be harder than a normal and must comply with its respective mode's difficulty-specific ranking criteria. Or in other words, it can be harder than 2 stars if it's still designed as a normal diff. This change took a couple months to catch on though. Lots of mappers were afraid to rank maps with lowest diff normals above 2 stars, both because the change was poorly communicated to the public, and also because going by the ranking criteria's difficulty-specific requirements wasn't all that realistic. What's defined as a normal difficulty is somewhat loose because defining exact info that applies to every song is impossible. And so depending on interpretation, something closer to a hard diff could be considered a normal diff under the new ranking criteria. In order to avoid that, a new criteria for lowest diff normals was established. It was much looser than the 2-star rule, but a bit more specific than the new ranking criteria's generalizations, and after some heated public discussion, it was finalized. So, in part because of the better ranking criteria, mappers then became more open to alternative low diff mapping. Myxo, being someone who cares about low diffs, naturally holds some of those alternative views on them. Views surprisingly similar to those of Sunny C. He's someone else I interviewed a couple months ago, and while the video featuring him didn't include it, I did ask him about some low difficulty related topics.
I think the most important thing to know when mapping lower difficulties is that the main value remains the same with the higher difficulties. When people map lower difficulties, they sometimes just limit themselves way too much, so they map all the drum beats and then not really express the song.
Myxo shares his preference of treating low diffs with a mindset similar to high diffs, and detailed kind of everything about his low diff mapping preferences to me. One segment he talked about really stood out to me personally.
So when I make lower difficulties, I do some things a little bit different. No, that sounds weird as well. It sounds like I'm special snowflake.
I'm going to make you out to be the most special of snowflakes.
Great. When I make lower difficulties, I have clear priorities on certain aspects, and the most important part for me is definitely the rhythm. Personally, I like to stick to one layer in the song extremely strictly, or as strict as possible. Someone who downloads the map set, they won't think about the drums or the guitar or whatever, they will think about the vocals of the song. And another thing I pay a lot of attention to in my rhythms is the use of rest moments. I think it's very good, especially when the map does some really difficult rhythms or really difficult patterns, just so that newbies can relax and get back into the beat of the song in case the pattern threw them off or something. And I try to avoid filler rhythm as much as possible as well.
Filler rhythm, in case you're unfamiliar, is the idea where gaps in rhythm are filled in order to make rhythm on high difficulties more predictable. Maybe it works in the upper tier and that's why people incorporate it on low difficulties too, but it ends up making low diffs way harder. Focusing on one instrument and leaving rest moments are things that practically no low diffs do today, but they're like some of the most essential techniques to making good low diffs in my opinion. What this also shows is that there's an important distinction to make here. While treating low diffs with values similar to high diffs can be good, that doesn't always mean using the exact same concepts. As has been said already, what works on an extra doesn't necessarily work on an easy. It's the mindset that should be the same when mapping low and high diffs, not just the techniques, which allows both to follow the music in ways valid for their respective difficulty. So yeah, that'll cover low diff mapping from the view of a mapper who enjoys creating them. There's more behind his low diffs than I could showcase here, so check them out yourself if you actually want to know. Thanks to Myxo for doing this interview, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.